WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and I'm going to have cake, so that makes it fun. Next week, I am entering the Dundalk High Hall of Fame. We want to invite everybody out for our festivities. We'll be telling you more about that. That is next Friday. It's a homecoming day for Dundalk, so I'll be going home. And I'll tell you what, the Washington Nationals are going to be going home this evening. It's going to be Game 5. We endured Game 5 of Yankees-Cleveland, some of us well after midnight. Luke Jones joins us now live via satellite to discuss all things baseball in the midst of Ravens and Bears week here. And certainly the Bears are still in Chicago. The Cubs are already on their way here. This has turned out to be what I thought would be the cat fight that it is. I didn't think the Cubs were going to go quietly, and certainly they had their opportunities in Game 4.
They really did, but just way too much Steven Strasburg. I mean, he for all the controversy about him being sick and whether Washington was going to pitch him, and it was supposed to be Tanner Roark, and then they get closer to game time on Wednesday, and they say, well, it might be Steven Strasburg, and it ends up being Steven Strasburg, and he was sensational. I mean, 7 shutout innings. That changeup was just unhittable. 12 strikeouts, gives up 3 hits, just the 2 walks. He was as good, if not better, than he's ever been at any point during his career. I mean, that was as strong as it gets when you consider the odds. I mean, it's one thing to pitch that way in the middle of May or in late July. It's another thing to do that when your team needs to win to stave off elimination.
Well, it's an all-timer, right? I mean, when you consider an elimination game, and I remember big games being pitched tonight, that was a Curt Schilling-esque, name any great, postseason start. 7 innings, 12 strikeouts. That's where it's at, right?
Yeah, and when you consider, just the beating he was taking on social media and talk radio in D.C., there was so much animosity. And look,
and all of it's nonsense in the end, right? So it was a lot of hot air, right?
Well, it's nonsense because he pitched really well. If he doesn't pitch and they get eliminated, then everyone's questioning it. If he comes out and doesn't pitch all that well, then everyone's saying, okay, well, if you're really that sick, you shouldn't have pitched. It's one of those things where, you're kind of darned if you do, darned if you don't, really, unless you go out there and you just pitch lights out. And that's what he was able to do. And, as far as the whole controversy, I know Scott Boras did an interview that said he had flu-like symptoms, and there was talk about their hotel, and Dusty Baker mentioned mold and all kinds of stuff. Just it was all just very bizarre how it all played out until he took the hill on Wednesday afternoon, and he was just brilliant. And you look on the flip side. Jake Arrieta, gutsy, clearly didn't have as good command, but keep in mind this guy was coming off of the hamstring issue a couple weeks ago. John Lester was very good in pitching in relief, but you look at the bullpen. Carl Edwards gets into trouble. Wade Davis comes in and gives up a grand slam to Michael A. Taylor. It's just incredible.
Yeah, the game was so manageable. That it was such a good game, and then it was like pop, and then all the Cubs fans are walking out into the rain, and it's like, all right. And the game went on for another 45 minutes. They had a chance in the 8th to get a couple, and, it wasn't a bad ending, but it was a little bit anticlimactic, although I think, what is setting up in D.C., and I don't just mean the Foo Fighters concert, wink, wink, Luke, down the street there at the Anthem, this is setting up to be one hell of an evening, right?
Oh, no question about it. Kyle Hendricks is going to go for the Cubs. Certainly someone who has pitched some big-time games for them. And Dusty Baker, at least after the game Wednesday night, they said Gio Gonzalez or Tanner Roark.
It won't be Strasburg.
Right. It's not going to be him. But you know how this works. All hands are going to be on deck. Other than yesterday, the yesterday's starters, you're not going to see or you'll see just about anyone.
Yeah, Max Scherzer, please report for duty, right?
Exactly. I was just going to say, he's the guy that comes to mind that I would not at all be surprised to see Max Scherzer throw at least a couple innings in this game. So, it just comes down to that. You have to begrudgingly, whether you're a Nationals fan or not, you have to give them credit for the way that they were able to get off the mat. Going back to Game 2 in D.C., they looked like they were kind of on their way to potentially being swept. When you consider they were going back to Wrigley for Game 3. Of course, Harper hits the big home run. Zimmerman hits the big home run. They even it up, and you just, for as weird, as bizarre as the 24 hours were from just before the rain out on Tuesday until Strasburg. It was official that Strasburg was going to get the ball. They certainly came out and they played really, really well. And I mean, the pressure, it's funny. I saw one of my, a friend of mine that works in the D.C. media who made a comment after the game saying, man, I wish the Nationals could just stay at Wrigley. And I think his point was the pressure would have been all on the Cubs had they been just playing Game 5 at Wrigley. Instead, they come home to D.C., where they've had so many meltdowns and how many different sports in these types of situations. You almost think it would have been better for Washington if they had continued to play on the road. But alas, they'll come home, and we'll see exactly who gets the ball, and we'll see if a Washington team can break through that glass ceiling here.
I was expecting when it was 1-0, I'm like, Strasburg's going to go all this way, and the whole story of life with the Nationals is the bullpen's going to blow the game, right? And I thought, you watch. You're right in front of Bill Murray, in front of everybody in Wrigley. They're going to, and then they hit the grand slam, and I'm like, well, they'll just do it at home now. It'll be more delicious that way. So we'll be watching that. Nothing to say about the Dodgers, though, right? Like, they're just sort of chilling out there in the palm trees, sort of waiting for somebody to get on a plane and get out there this weekend. Whoever gets there is going to be pretty tired at this point from flying back and forth, and sometimes that momentum actually helps, and the Nationals pitching's deep enough. So is the Cubs, quite frankly. But, boy, the Dodgers are just sitting out there chilling out, right?
They really are. I mean, you can set up your rotation, your bullpen's rested. About the only thing you look to, and it's kind of what you alluded to, is you sit too long.
Stay sharp, right? Yeah.
I mean, and you're just not used to doing that in baseball. It's one thing to talk about in the NFL when you're one of the top 2 seeds in the conference. You get a bye. I mean, you need that. I mean, teams are so banged up physically, but when you're with baseball, I mean, other than the All-Star break, you're not used to having 3-4 days off. I mean, it's very much takes you out of your element. And I think if you're the Dodgers, and we'll certainly talk about what happened to Cleveland, you kind of look at that and you say, well, you know what? Just because we won over 100 games and had all this mojo, it can be very fleeting. And Cleveland's a perfect example of that. So, if you're the Dodgers, I mean, yeah, you're sitting pretty from a planning standpoint, from a rest standpoint, but that doesn't mean that you can just turn the light switch back on and everything's going to be fine. So, certainly whichever team prevails here in this division series, they're going to have the momentum from just playing in these high-stakes games, having their back against the wall. Whichever team it is, that's where they'll have a little bit of an edge against the Dodgers, whereas the Dodgers, they took care of business against Arizona, and there was very, very little drama involved with it.
Well, and you talk about drama. The Yankees and the Indians certainly provided plenty of that, well into the evening. And Cleveland gets back in the game in the 5th, as you would have expected them to do. And then, of course, the Yankees go and salt it in the end and in front of the Cleveland crowd. And insert your Cleveland joke here. You and I have been to Cleveland many times and have meandered through downtown. I think we still stand a little either aghast or aglow at the size of the parade last year for the Cavaliers. But, this was the best modern Cleveland sports team outside of any of the LeBron stuff. Maybe ever, maybe more talented than any of those Browns teams that never made it or whatever. This was a really, really good, complete team that felt like it had everything going, including a 2-0 advantage in this series.
Yeah, I mean, you just look at the dominance that they had over the second half of the season. I mean, keep in mind, this was a team that treading water would be a little too strong, but they didn't really find their stride until after the All-Star break. And, of course, they really were able to find it in August when they began that historic winning streak. But it just kind of proves what we all know. We think that just because teams get into the postseason that the best team is just going to prevail, and it doesn't work that way. I mean, baseball, even the best teams still lose a high percentage of their games. And when you've added the second round, the division round in, as they did beginning in the mid-'90s, these teams that just steamroll and do so well in the regular season, I mean, it becomes a little more of a roll of the dice. I mean, I'm not saying it's a complete 50-50 proposition, but you see more of that. And the biggest example of this, I mean, Corey Kluber. I mean, this guy, by all accounts, by most accounts, I think is going to be the Cy Young in the American League. Was terrific for them. I think I saw someone posted during his start on Wednesday night, I believe he gave up 2 home runs all year on his breaking ball. That curve, that slider, whatever. We kind of, people debate how you should define it, and even he does a little bit, but had given up 2 home runs all year on his breaking ball. And he gave up 2 home runs on his breaking ball in this series. I mean, just incredible to think that. But you saw it, and you saw it with Didi Gregorius' first home run. His command just wasn't there. Pitch location was off. Missed his location on both of the home runs, and they didn't swing the bats. I mean, it's just that simple. I mean, Kluber wasn't very good, at least against Didi Gregorius. He was pretty good against everyone else, and then. You saw what happened late in the game. Brett Gardner with just a fantastic at-bat and ends up collecting the RBI single. And what was an all-too-common theme for Cleveland, and this is where I will beat them up because this isn't quite it's one thing just to lose games, and the Indians were a good team as well, but Cleveland kicked the ball around a heck of a lot in this series, especially when they got up to, you just can't do that. You have to be sharp. I mean, these games are so tough to win, and the odds are so high. The stakes are so high, and to just commit the number of errors that they did and just not to be sharp defensively, it's no wonder.
You know what, man? I'll say this. You and I have been watching baseball a long time. That Orioles team that was really good a couple years ago, the Kansas City, I don't remember them ever kicking. When the Orioles were playing good ball, they were good 2 out of those years, really good, and certainly really, really good the last part of the summer. And they didn't kick the ball around like ever, and that's kind of a hallmark of a good team because there are very few teams that are so good. And even when you go back and think about those Yankees teams that were so good in the late 90s, they were all good fielding teams as well. They had good fielding pitchers. I mean, all of that kind of stuff. And it really does matter, and it matters even more when that one mistake is going to cost you a game in a 5-game series, but even more so the Girardi story, the mental errors that Girardi made earlier in the series, I think sort of brought focus into what Buck Showalter did last year and allowing Zach Britton on the end of the bench, which probably, as I pointed out that a year ago this week, that'll probably be right on the epitaph. That'll be, they could have won, but, it was his big blunder. Certainly Girardi didn't want the end of this season to be the blunder and everyone talking about that any more than Buck wanted it last offseason, right?
Well, and Joe Girardi, I mean, my goodness, we're just seeing what happened with John Farrell being fired by the Red Sox, regardless of what might have gone on behind closed doors or what some of the other reasons were, but they didn't win. And if the Yankees, as much as everyone views them as being ahead of schedule, and they are. I think most people looked at that team this year and thought, okay, maybe they're 500, maybe they win 85 games, maybe they're kind of hanging around in wild card contention, and they took off. And but as much as that was a good feeling for that organization as far as getting back to what they're accustomed to, Joe Girardi, if they are swept after that happened with the failed challenge, you do wonder if they decide to make a change. Now, probably not as likely, but the thing about him that I like, which, and this is where I'll take Buck Showalter to task a little bit. Buck has never really flat out said he really messed up there. He's talked about hindsight, and he's talked about if he could go back and do it all over again, but he's never flat out admitted I really screwed up there. And
denial is a river in Egypt, right? We got Harbaugh on tape saying he should have called a timeout instead of letting Cundiff run out there, right?
Yeah, it's one of those things where he's kind of sort of acknowledged, but has never flat out said I messed up, just plain and simple. And to his credit, and he didn't do it that night, but the next day, Joe Girardi did say I screwed up. And I saw even went to Brian Cashman, their general manager, and said I apologize. I need to be better for our club. And to his credit, or I guess more so to his team's credit, they really picked him up. You have to give the Yankees credit. And it's funny, I saw someone make the comment on Twitter during Game 5, and I couldn't help but agree. The Yankees, we know they're the Yankees, and they're a team from New York. All the world championships. You're just completely conditioned to hate them unless you're a Yankees fan. But you do look at that team, and I'll put Aroldis Chapman aside. Everyone else on that team, for the most part, there's some likable guys on that team. And, the way that they've won with youth, they have a mix of youth and some veteran players. If they weren't the Yankees, I feel like it'd be a pretty cool story when you consider.
Yeah, there's nobody there larger than life yet. I mean, they've tried to make Sanchez and Judge. They've built them up just to chop them down, quite frankly. But Brett Gardner's been there forever, and sometimes I look at him and say, well, he'd be a good Oriole or whatever. But he feels sort of Markakis-ish to me. He doesn't. There's nothing. Ellsbury's been a bust. I mean, Frazier. I mean, I don't. There's nothing there that stands out that says Jeter and Clemens and Boggs and Posada, any of those names, and they're winning. And dude, if you go back to spring training, I was the guy that said beware of the Yankees, and the Yankees are playing. I mean, I hate to be sort of crystal ballish about it, but I did think that they were doing it a different kind of way, and I love the way they came on at the end of last season instead of churning out after all the trades were made and they threw in the white towel and all that. They still stay involved in the race. That said a lot to me, not only about Girardi, but about the heart and soul of those guys, who Gregorius, who Sanchez, some of these young guys, and then Judge came on this year. But it is... If you're a Yankee fan, this is a whole different kind of postseason. You've never seen any of these guys play in a big spot, really.
I mean, a few of them. That's
Sabathia, right?
Yeah, and I wanted to mention it. I mean, that was, and certainly he ran into trouble in the fifth inning. They got a couple runs to make that a 3-2 game, but that was kind of an impressive throwback kind of a performance from Sabathia. I mean, clearly he's not the power pitcher that he was earlier in his career. I mean, this guy tops out at maybe 90, 91 at this point. But really effective with the slider. And, kind of the story of the game, I mean, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention 31 strikeouts total in this game. I mean, for as much as people talk about pace of play and those issues with baseball and adding a pitch clock, I'll continue to say, I mean, the biggest issue is just balls not being put in play. I mean, it's that simple. I mean, you want stuff that you want action. And I don't know what the answer is for that specifically. And I'm not trying to beat up this game specifically, but it's just a reflection on the number of strikeouts that we're seeing.
But, this is how the analytics is changing the game, right? Pitchers know exactly what the weakness is. They adjust their defense to exactly the way they're going to pitch, and then the hitters can't touch the baseball, literally, right? The science behind the pitching, I think, of making the hitter guess is a lot harder than it is for the hitter to guess where the ball's going to be and then actually hit it in the quarter of a blink of an eye, which is literally the speed it moves at, right?
Well, I mean, you just have more velocity in this game than you've ever seen. I mean, I don't want to say the pitching is better than it's ever been necessarily, but the talent level, the ability is better than it's ever been across the board. And you're seeing that with the extraordinary number of strikeouts. And, the approach on the flip side, you have a lot of players that, aren't so much consumed with making contact as much as hitting the ball out of the ballpark, and when they do make contact, that being damaging contact. So what you end up having is fewer balls put in play, more home runs, more strikeouts. You throw the walks in there, and you have so many of these guys that are just completely predicated on the three true outcomes. And
and 3 hours and 52 minutes later, the game ends.
right. So, and I don't know what all the solutions are there. But I saw a crazy statistic. I can't remember if it was Game 3 or Game 4 for the Yankees, and I can't remember who put it out there on Twitter. But I believe the comment was the Yankees did not have a single fastball thrown that was less than either 95 or 96 miles per hour the entire night. I mean, that's just, it might have been when Severino pitched. Just incredible to think of. I mean, just think about that. I mean, 15, 20 years ago, I mean, when a pitcher threw 95 miles per hour, it was a big deal. When a pitcher threw 100, you were saying, holy cow.
That's Nolan Ryan, right.
Something really, really special. And the Yankees in a playoff game didn't throw a single fastball less than 95 miles per hour. I mean, that's crazy when you think about it. And it really does speak to how different this game has become, and that's why it's so difficult to compare players across different eras. I mean, it is just such a different game now than it was in 1995, and it was that much different back in 1975. But, as much as there was great drama, I was entertained, don't get me wrong, but, yeah, 31 strikeouts total in Game 5 between the Indians and the Yankees.
And these are the good teams.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, I mean, good hitting beats pitching. I mean, a good pitching beats hitting. And Sabathia, for all the money, all the weight, all the jokes, all the falling apart, they're just going to get rid of him. He's sort of kind of a little bit of their Ubaldo, kind of sort of for the amount of money they gave him in the way that he's talked about. To go back to the place where, they probably hate him for leaving. Amazing effort in Game 5. I mean, he'll always have that. Hey, I got us into the LCS. I pitched us into that after all this, after all the money I made, which I earned or didn't earn or wherever it was. In the end, I had an exclamation point, right?
No question. And I mean, this is a guy who's had, just because we kind of think of the last few years, I mean, clearly the issue with the alcohol problem. But, I mean, this is a guy who's had a hell of a career. And you kind of forget it because he hasn't been as good the last few years. But, again, the 96-mile-per-hour fastball didn't come back. But, I mean, you look at how he was able to pitch. I mean, commanded his pitches really well. 9 strikeouts, which matched his season high. And he did that in 4 1/3 innings. I mean, that's impressive. I don't know if he's going to duplicate that at any point the rest of the way. But, that's a veteran pitcher who's pitched in plenty of big spots. In a ballpark where he's won a ton of games, won more games there than any other pitcher.
17-game winner in 2001, Luke. Where were you in 2001?
2001, I was a freshman in college.
Well, that would tell you, and he was winning 17 games then in Cleveland, now 237 wins. And, the other part about him is taking the ball in October. He's done that, let's see here, 21 times now.
Yeah, I mean, you think about that. Clearly had some big games that he pitched with Cleveland. What he was able to do with Milwaukee for that 1 year, where he was just. That guy was that stretch with the Brewers was as good as that'll stack up with just about anything in the history of modern, at least the last 20 or 30 years. And then went to New York and wasn't always pretty, but look at his numbers in New York for the better part of close to a decade. Yeah. He got to age 33, 34 in the knee, obviously the alcohol. So he's had his demons. There's no doubt about that.
This year was sort of his Jim Palmer bounce back in '83. He won this was the first year in 5 years that he was good, and certainly the first year they would have stuck him on the mound in Game 5 of a game like this, right? I mean, and felt good about it, and then come out the other side on a plane going to Houston, ready to play on Friday night, right?
Yeah, and to his credit, he wasn't bad last year, but this year he kind of got back to being, again, the makeup is totally different than what CC Sabathia was earlier in his career, but as far as the success, had an ERA of 3.69, won 14 games, certainly benefited from run support. I mean, that's a heck of a lineup there. So all their pitchers have that going for them, but, I'll throw another name out there. It kind of reminds you of Mike Messina's renaissance at the end of his very last season, where he won 20 games after being pretty darn bad the previous year to the point where they took him out of the rotation even. So, Sabathia, we'll see what happens with him as far as his future, not just the rest of this postseason, but beyond that. But, you're talking about a guy who's won 237 games in his career, and, a career 3.7 ERA doesn't sound that great until you remember that this guy began his career in the height of the steroids era and put up some pretty impressive numbers at that point. So this is a guy who, when it's all said and done, there's going to be plenty of talk as far as consideration, at least for him when it comes to Cooperstown.
Well, the Verlanders, the Keuchels, we'll have it all together. It'll be Yankees and Astros. We'll be watching out on Twitter and on Facebook. And, of course, the Nationals and the Cubs. And the winner heads off to the palm trees. He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter. And, of course, he's on the backfields in Owings Mills for all things Ravens this week as well. I'm monitoring some caps. We got the Terps playing on Saturday afternoon as the folks. Half of Chicago's here, whether it's Cubs or Northwestern or the Bears this week. We got plenty of Bears conversation around here as well. If you missed anything, it's all out in the BuyAToyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. Our morning newspaper ships to your email inbox. 7 a.m. each and every morning. It's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where it's still $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life. Absolutely guaranteed. And then, of course, the text service, if there's breaking news, good news, bad news, there'll be Orioles news in the offseason as well. You'll get it first on the WNST text service. That's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. And Dennis Kolatzos is here this Thursday, next Thursday, every Thursday from 3 until 5. It is the SSV on WNST giving you a break. Christos got you handled here this week as we get ready for the Bears. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.